Okay, so welcome to part 2. We are incredibly excited today to have Unesco's Global Education Monitoring Report come and share an early consultation, just really lead a discussion with us around some of the important areas in non-state actors in education. So with us today, we have Manos Antoninis, the director of Unesco's Global Education Monitoring, or GEM report, and Cristina D'Addio, who's a senior policy analyst with the GEM report. So I want to thank you both for joining us. The breakdown of the second part, in a second, I'll introduce the director, Manos Antoninis, to go over some of the basics of the early thinking around the 2021-2022 GEM report. But the majority of this is really a chance for us to have a conversation on some of the key areas related to non-state actors in education. And we'll separate that conversation into 4 pieces. So we're looking at provision, financing, governance, and then the influence of the non-state actors in education. This is part of a related concept note. So I'll be sharing the link to that concept note in the chat shortly, which will also give you some background information that was feeding into this forthcoming report. So again, I'm really excited to have both Manos and Anna joining us today. Manos, I think you're going to be leading our so Manos, I think you're going to be leading us. So I'd like to give a brief introduction and welcome the director of the report, Manos Antoninis. So Manos joined the report team in August 2011 from Oxford Policy Management, a development policy consultancy. He's worked as a monitoring and evaluation expert in the education sector projects, including a public expenditure tracking and service delivery survey of secondary education provision in Bangladesh, the evaluation of a basic education project in the western provinces of China, the midterm evaluation of the Education for All Fast Track Initiative, the annual reporting of progress in the implementation of second primary education development project in Bangladesh, a basic education capacity building program in 6 states in Nigeria, the evaluation of in-service cluster-based teacher training program in Pakistan, and the country study of out-of-school children global initiative in Indonesia. He holds a BA in International Economics from the Athens University of Economics, Business, and an MSc in Development Economics from the University of Oxford. His DPhil was a study of technical education in the labor market in Egypt, completed at the Center for the Study of African Economies of the University of Oxford. So thanks, Manos, for joining us today. And I want to let you go ahead and come on forward. Just tell me when I need to move things forward on our slides.
Sure. I think it's quite difficult to have someone else changing slides for you, but this is a short presentation, so I'm sure it will be absolutely fine. Thank you very much for inviting us to this event today, which ties nicely with the presentation of Joanna's book. For those of you, I don't know how diverse your group is, just to say a few things. First of all, to apologize because I won't be able to stay till the end, so I'll be here for the first hour. But then Anna will be staying till the end of the presentation. But that's good news because I think your description of the report as being at an early thinking probably only applies to me. I'm just emerging from the grueling cycle of the 2020 report on inclusion. We just launched our second and final regional edition on Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia on Friday. But Anna has been leading the preparation of the 2021-22 report, which is scheduled for launch in October. And she and her team have just submitted the second draft. So we'll not really talk about early thinking for anyone but me. But that still makes it a very timely moment as we are getting ready to share our draft with our expert group in the coming weeks. And I think your thoughts and suggestions at this point will be extremely valuable. Just for those of you who may not be familiar with the report, and I suspect quite a few might not be, let's look at the second slide. The report exists since 2002, and it is quite an unusual creation in the UN world, let's say. We are an editorially independent report hosted and published by UNESCO. We monitored originally the international education goals between 2000, which were the education for all goals between 2002 and 2015. But the experiment was supposed to be successful, and therefore in 2015, the report received an official mandate at the World Education Forum from the world's governments this time, and not as an arrangement between the international, let's say, donors community and UNESCO and countries. So our mandate is twin, to be the mechanism for monitoring and reporting on SDG 4 and on education in the other SDGs, and that explains why we have monitoring part that after 2015 goes through the SDG 4 targets. There's a chapter for each one of them, plus a chapter on the relationship of education with the other SDGs, and a chapter on finance. But in addition, we also have the obligation to report on the implementation of national and international strategies to help hold all relevant partners to account for their commitments. And that explains why there is a theme, a thematic part. This is the way we have been approaching the issue since we were established. And we have an advisory board, international advisory board, that's very representative of different communities and constituencies around the world that advises us and helps us decide on that theme. So the theme for this year, this forthcoming year, is the theme of non-state actors. But let's look at the next slide and the themes that we have covered since 2016. So we started with the relationship between education and the other sustainable development goals. We then moved to the theme of accountability in education, and of course Will is very familiar with this topic, and the one that followed, the migration displacement in 2019. The 2020 theme was inclusion, as I just mentioned, and we already know the theme of the 2023 report. I forgot to update the dates. COVID has set us back by 3 to 4 months really to this schedule. So we're just making up for that lost time. For those of you who may not be familiar, this is just the main output of the report, but actually there's a lot more that first of all accompanies the global report. So there's a summary that is translated in 30 languages. There's a youth edition. There is a gender edition. And since last year, or the year before now, there's also a regional edition. We take the theme of the report and we go in depth in 1 or 2 regions. So we publish an edition on the Arab states for the migration and displacement theme. And we had 2 regional editions on Latin America and the Caribbean, and on the former transition countries, as I just mentioned, for the inclusion theme. And we are already working on regional edition for the non-state actors report that will focus on South Asia. So this is just what is related to the global report itself. In addition, we have 3 online resources. One is the World Inequality Database on Education, which is now, since 2019, jointly run with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, which called WIDE, and is offering the chance to compare countries' education indicators, comparing disparities between countries and especially within countries with respect to a range of characteristics and their intersections. That exists now for 10 years. But since last year, we have launched 2 new websites. One is called Scope, and that is an online interactive counterpart to the monitoring part of the report, which organizes our thinking on the progress towards the global education goals in 5 narratives on access, equity, quality, finance, and learning. And We also have the peer website, which was launched with the inclusion report, and that's very relevant also for our discussion today. Essentially, we have extended the coverage of the material that we cannot put essentially on the report itself, offering information on laws and policies in all countries with reference to the theme of the report. So we had the laws and policies in 2020 on how countries approach inclusion in education. And as I will mention later on, we will be extending that this year with, and we are extending it already, with information on how countries regulate private provision or non-state actor provision of education around the world, to offer a basis for countries to learn from each other and to also enrich the material that we provide that we cannot possibly fit in the pages of the report. Finally, we also have policy papers that we publish about 5 a year, our blog, and a range of other materials that I would like to invite you to join, to go to the website to consult. Going to the next slide, as you see a little bit, and as you can probably understand from the timing of the report cycle, we have a production cycle that extends over about 2 years. Maybe now has been extended with the addition of the regional reports. We start with a think piece, which in the case of the non-state actors report was prepared by Prachi Srivastava. And then on the basis of that as a core input, we develop a concept note. And that's basically what I'm going to present to you briefly today. And then there's a consultation that follows, but that was already about a year ago. And then successive drafts of the report begin until we reach the stage we have reached now, which is the second draft that has been traditionally shared with a group of experts that help us provide feedback and guide us for the final stages as we start the editing and production process. So this is a very complex theme, perhaps less complex than the theme of inclusion, which was all-encompassing. It has its quite defined boundaries. Maybe some of these boundaries are a bit contested, but still it's a bit more manageable as a subject compared to inclusion. I will describe to you a little bit how we approach it, and also I'm going to say a few things about how the report is going to be organizing its information. Let me start first of all by saying that because the report is always based on SDG 4, SDG 4 is its starting point and the reason how we justify any particular topic. It's important to remind ourselves how the framework for action, which is the foundation document of the agenda, describes non-state actors, or let's say the overall framework and frame of it and framing. It describes education as a fundamental human right and as an enabling right for whose fulfillment countries must ensure universal equal access to inclusive and equitable quality education. It also describes it as a public good of which the state is the duty bearer, but also a shared societal endeavor, which implies an inclusive process of public policy formulation and implementation, where civil society and the private sector, among others, have important roles in realizing the right to quality education, with the state having an essential role in setting and regulating standards and norms. So these are quite important principles, starting principles for the report, and they are drawn from a range of instruments. Of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and its Article 26 contains 3 paragraphs on the right to education, which recognize that education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages, at least that's how there was their formulation at the time. Education shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations. And thirdly, that parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education that shall be given to their children. So the framework also dedicates 2 paragraphs to the role of non-state actors in financing, and they are also important for our discussion. It recognizes that the private sector, philanthropic organizations, and foundations can play an important role using their experience, innovative approaches, business expertise, and financial resources to strengthen public education. So it recognizes that they can mobilize additional resources for public education, including by paying fair taxes, and focus those resources on priority areas. It recognizes that these actors can help education and skills training planners understand labor market trends and skills needs to facilitate school to work transition, and also that it can increase inclusive education opportunities by providing additional services and activities to reach the most marginalized. This is actually a topic that we covered in this year's report on inclusion. But it also recognizes that governance mechanisms need to ensure that when private funding is used for the benefit of education, that it should serve public provision. So these are some of the points that inevitably the report will need to cover, given that they have been covered in the framework for action. Now, we know very well that very few topics in education have generated as much passion as the role of non-state actors. A key question is whether education is a public or a private good, whether it is a form of consumption or a form of investment. We know that many countries in today's high-income countries took the decision in the 18th and 19th centuries to invest in education publicly because they recognized the importance of public provision for the benefits that it provided to society. And also in the 20th century, the newly independent states decided to build a public education system that was really emblematic of their national aspirations. I recall now what Joanna was mentioning earlier about the bricks and the road that helped actually, well, now has been tarmacked. It's actually interesting that in a number of countries, perhaps the same thing happened, but then it was reversed. I'm familiar with Bangladesh and Nigeria, where I worked, as you heard in Will's description. And it was actually very interesting that in 1974, both countries had essentially completely non-state education systems. But Bangladesh's independence and the outlook of the government at the time, and Nigeria's newfound wealth through the oil, made them essentially nationalize the education system that existed there. So has not always been a clear-cut and straightforward path of how countries have developed their non-state or their public education systems. There has been a lot of country specificities. But despite the fact that education has clear public good dimensions that are fundamental to society's growth and development, education is always also a fiercely private good, because consuming more of it improves individuals' opportunities, which means that others may be excluded from these same opportunities. Education becomes the vehicle for differentiation and advancement, since those who manage to climb the education ladder are better placed to achieve a higher standard of living and derive high returns. So as education systems cannot accommodate everybody in the higher ranks of that ladder, families take all possible steps to ensure that their children are those that make it to the top. And that race generates the demand, which leads to the supply of particular education goods and services and establishments essentially of markets in education. So depending on context, these markets may appear in the direct provision of education or in other services, and that's something that is often forgotten. We may not have private schools, but we may have private supplementary tuition on an enormous scale that shadows the education system. So, so while states have a duty to fulfill the citizens' right to education, a wide range of non-state actors in different forms and shapes through different arrangements play a significant role. These actors have a variety of motivations, from charity to profit, and activities may or may not involve collaboration with the government. So there is a lot of controversy about these issues, and I don't need to dwell right now on those who support and those who oppose state provision. The arguments are, of course, well documented and will be covered extensively in the report. Just to say that the report will try to, as I will mention in a minute, has 4 core chapters that refer primarily to basic education. But in addition, we will be having 3 specific chapters that cover particular levels of education that have slightly different characteristics. Early childhood is dominated currently by non-state provision in many countries, and compliance with standards is an issue that needs to be particularly closely monitored. In addition, we have also the case of tertiary education, for which it's quite difficult to understand the current trends, while globally there are clear trends towards increasing the increased private provision in primary and secondary education, and also in early childhood. The patterns are not entirely clear for higher education. They are definitely increasing in some countries. In some other countries, they have been high for a very, very long time without increasing any further. So it is hard, also given the differences in definition that are being applied. But definitely, there has been a shift, regardless of the very form of provision that we observe. There has been a shift towards making households pay more on the of the fees for tertiary education, which has various implications on equity and quality. Finally, there will be a chapter on technical, vocational, and adult education, which to some extent is perhaps the most privatized mechanism of education, considering that a lot of the skills that are being acquired by people are not really available to a very large extent through public education systems. So let's go to the next slide, which provides the core of the report, the 4 themes as we envisage them. Starting from the provision, I already highlighted to some extent how we envisage the provision to be covered in the report. First and foremost is, of course, the core education services, how essentially primary and secondary private schools exist, and they can be, of course, there can be various forms of those. They can be active in ordinary contexts or in emergencies. They can be, in the case of higher education, of course, they can be domestic or foreign. There can be so many different combinations of those. But in addition to the core education services, which is usually where we mostly focus, and that was also the focus of this discussion this morning so far, there are also other services, those that support learning. I mentioned already supplementary private tuition, which has been making inroads not just in poorer countries, but also in high-income countries, even in recent years, which can be provided in homes or online through all sorts of different mechanisms. But we also have companies that are involved in textbook publishing, in assessments, and as we have seen more recently with the COVID crisis, online learning content and education technologies that can potentially dominate education systems and affect even the core services. And finally, we have other support goods and services. Non-state actors are involved in infrastructure development. They're also involved in school catering, in cleaning services, a range of services that often raise interesting questions about procurement. Coming to financing, non-state education provision is primarily financed by households and sometimes by governments through subsidies and grants. To a much lesser extent, other actors such as businesses and rich individuals also make contributions. The report is focusing actually quite a lot on the role of households. We have traditionally argued and made the case, but this time I think we'll have much more comprehensive evidence that households have been contributing a far larger share of total spending than currently exists, currently is recognized, and the impact of that on equity is not sufficiently recognized, and it's a time for the international community to actually turn attention to that. On governments, we will look at how different countries support school choice through vouchers and related mechanisms, through operational subsidies to non-state schools as well, or sometimes with contracts and different arrangements that provide a certain degree of autonomy to providers themselves. That's to some extent captured in the literature under the banner of public-private partnerships, and we'll be discussing the opportunities and risks to those goods, to those arrangements. Donors, perhaps not so much of an evidence given, not so much of a discussion given that their role is quite small, but it's an interesting field of battle between different proponents and opponents of support to private provision that we will analyze and compare. And finally, the role of philanthropy, which is not perhaps so large financially, but can be quite important on other fronts related to the influence issue that I will discuss in a minute. Coming to governance, the report examines whether and what types of regulation exist regarding non-state actors and whether existing regulations are fit for purpose. It will approach the issue from a system-wide perspective, recognizing that both public and private actors need to be held accountable for compliance with minimum standards. As I mentioned, we will be, and we are already collecting information on how every country regulates non-state activity. And where possible, we also pay attention to implementation aspects of these regulations. We'll also look beyond regulation at the variety of other accountability mechanisms that exist at different levels of education, including, as were mentioned earlier, the Abidjan principles as an attempt to base the debates on a rights-based discussion. And we will be covering regulation at all different levels. The final chapter, substantive chapter, that, as I said, mainly refers to basic and secondary education, but I really will be cutting across all education levels, is what we call influence and innovation. Many actors are involved in the generation and use of evidence for policy, including on the production side, research funding bodies, researchers, and research dissemination platforms, but also on the uptake side, teacher unions, civil society, think tanks, private sector associations, and the media. So the report will discuss how lobbying and advocacy activities through networks promote or oppose public-private relationship in education around the world. And in that sense, we'll discuss how research differs depending on researchers' positions along these various divides. We'll also discuss innovation. While many non-state actors are driven by commercial considerations, others are dedicated to searching for solutions to teaching, learning, and accountability challenges, to catalyze changes, and to strengthen national education systems. So understanding the innovations developed thanks to the support of non-state actors, and whether or how they have been adopted by governments, will provide a basis for discussion for future engagement. The report will also examine government responses and engagement rules for non-state actors who are intent on promoting their worldviews through education systems, especially in curricula. So just to conclude, the key questions are outlined on this slide. I'm reading them out, and I guess it's the basis for the discussion that is going to follow. How are non-state actors engaged in the provision of core and support education goods and services? The typology that comes with that, which sometimes is important because there are a number of myths about how education systems are organized. What are the effects of non-state provision of education on access, equity, inclusion, quality, learning, and efficiency, but with a particular attention to equity, which should be really the overriding objective that governments should serve if they decide to have provision outside their own mechanisms. How is non-state activity in education funded? As I mentioned, this broader perspective than sometimes is currently occupying the debate. Is regulation of non-state activity fit for purpose? And finally, what influence do non-state actors exert on education systems in the field of ideas? Ideas that can be both constructive but also destructive. So that brings me to an end, and I hope that will stimulate an interesting set of questions from you. The floor is back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Manos, for a wonderful overview of the GEM report and this forthcoming framework for your report on non-state actors in education. We're going to move towards a consultation piece in a bit, where we'll basically be going through those 4 pieces that Manos introduced as the key kind of thematic chapters and this forthcoming report, looking at provision, financing, governance, and influence and innovation. Before we move to that, though, I've got a couple of questions that have been raised in the chat box. I wanted to see if there are any other real pressing questions that people wanted to bring up. So I see, and so I'll invite you to either kind of ask the question. Please do introduce yourself and your affiliation for that. So Susan, I see you've got a question in the chat box. Do you want to expand on that question a bit? Let's see. Okay. Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Welcome.
Yes. Thank you very much for these interesting webinars, and hi, Manos. I wanted to just to ask, and it's probably premature because I haven't. I was just scanning the concept note. Are you also looking at approaches that are adopted by even the state system that are not schools? So, for example, when perhaps a part of the curriculum or an approach is commissioned to an NGO or the private sector, so you've got a non-state actor involved in part of the process of education, even if not in the school buildings and fabric.
Yes. So thank you for this question. I think it was important to mention that the report always tries to have as wide a coverage of the topic as possible, because it tries to serve this issue of universality, which is a principle of the SDGs. So for those of you who may be familiar with the report as it existed before 2015, when it was really primarily a report about just the world's poorest countries, and to some extent, from an agenda that was a little bit more north-south, direction. Post 2015, the SDGs, for whatever we may criticize them, actually are a universal agenda, and they try to capture the interest of everyone. And that's a purpose we also try to serve. And one key way is to really see at any particular phenomenon from every possible angle, if that is possible, of course, in the little space that we have. So in the debates within the development community, for example, low-fee private schools do dominate the discussion, but actually there's a lot more, and that's what I was trying to say. There's a lot more to that picture than just low-fee private schools. And the precise perspective that you brought, which is a curriculum aspect, for instance, is covered in the chapter on what we call, maybe misleadingly, but we're still trying to find the best way, innovation, influence and innovation, because private non-state actors often battle not just for profit at the like short-term profit, but also because they want to win in the battle of ideas. And we see people lobbying and acting in ways that don't necessarily yield profit, and you would not be really seeing that if one only focuses on provision and bricks and mortar and etc. So actors do operate in these ways. You do actually bring to my mind a very good example, given your UNICEF background, how UNICEF more recently has been, for instance, liaising with non-state actors to introduce curricula for, originally was for refugees, now it's becoming even broader. It's a very interesting question. Why is this happening? Why is this happening with this particular form? Why is a corporation involved? What does it mean? What will this lead? So these are kind of trench, let's say, battles that happen on the side. They may be or may not be as obvious. So it's definitely an aspect that we would be very interested to discuss. But if you have any particular examples that you'd like to draw our attention, we would be more than happy to look at them in depth and detail. And I should maybe conclude by saying, and we don't necessarily see that only from a negative perspective. Non-state actors are motivated for a very, very wide range of issues. We just need to look at educational history and see that some of the most important innovations have happened outside the public system by committed educationalists who were really trying to find good ideas. The question is, how are also good ideas being incorporated, whether such innovation is encouraged and nurtured and not suppressed? Because of course public education systems have also a tendency for standardization. That, you know, standardization can be also positive and negative. It depends on the context, it depends on the objectives of people. So we try to look at the issue from both sides, but as I said, good examples from you would be very, very, very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Manos.
Okay, I know we've got, thank you, Susan, for your question. I'm gonna move on down to Margaret. We've got a question. Would you like to expand on that and share it?
Hi, Will. Yes, I had a question. And my question was in regards to whether the report addresses issues of inequalities and discrimination that can arise from increased privatization in education. Yeah.
Yes, so I think I would say that the report has a long-standing interest and demonstrated interest in documenting inequality in education. I mentioned the example of our World Inequality Database on education, where essentially already since the mid-2000s we have been documenting and using household surveys to highlight such differences. It's true that there's not enough information in household surveys, although we're trying to improve that, on whether children are attending public or private schools. Unfortunately, the key instruments that we have, the key families of in cross-national household surveys do not often actually include that question. But from those countries that do, we are going to be looking at this topic. Now, your question is of course broader, whether increased privatization increases inequalities and discrimination. That's a much broader question. It's not just about whether families choose to go to a public or a private school, is whether other mechanisms that are happening may be leading to increased exclusion. And of course, we will be looking at that. And that's again, to a large extent, part of the discussion on the influence and innovation in education, because often in some of these examples, innovation is portrayed more often in rosy colors, not quite showing the darker side of it. I think the examples of COVID are, I think, quite powerful. This emphasis on distance education is, of course, welcome, and everybody understands governments need to take measures and find solutions to improve education conditions for as many students as possible. But it harms those who actually stand no chance to access these education opportunities. So, and to the extent that many of these opportunities are provided through non-state partnership with non-state actors, it can contribute to this. This is just one example, but there are of course many. At the same time, we should also recognize that some of the systems that have been heavily criticized for having led to increased segregation through the encouragement of private provision have been taking in recent years efforts to make up for the increased inequality, something that we don't see in systems that are supposedly free and public, and yet at the same time take no measures whatsoever to address inequalities. So it's something that one needs to look again from both sides, because sometimes free education systems end up being far more unequal than systems that may be charging, but at the same time trying to compensate for those fees. So one has to be careful not to be single-minded, but to look at the facts, at how which education systems are more or less educated. I mean, one example that comes to my mind is Chile for many years has been, of course, the bête noire of this debate, a system that was outrageously, one would say, segregationist in the system that was created. But for a long time now, the country has been trying to look at ways to make up for this severe problem. But you can look at a neighboring country like Argentina, which is in principle does not apply such measures that segregate, but private education has increased to a large degree and may be leading to as unequal education provision as in its neighbor, even though in principle it has never practiced a policy that was pro-private. So as I said, facts are very important for those debates to be a bit more clear.
Excellent. Thank you. Keith Lewin, do you want to come in on your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Manos. Very interesting. Yes, and this is going to be a very important report. I had a short question, really, but what lies behind it is quite deep. The role of non-state actors really requires some sort of theory of change that relates to development. This is not on public display at the moment. It's a silence in the room as to what the propositions are and how it is thought the involvement of private capital, whether domestic or international, can shape development in a sustainable way which doesn't create dependence and extraction. That's the complicated bit. I mean, a simple question is, for the report, is whether or not we see evidence of the beginnings of saturation, which are determined by things outside ideology. These are things like demography, clearly the income distribution and employment, which generates wages and salaries, which allows people to pay fees. These things are very real constraints on the growth of unsubsidized private sector. And my suspicion is, on the one hand, that we've had 20 or 30 years of growth to the margins of saturation, that is, so-called natural growth will not run in the future because we're against those margins. And that then increases the political pressure to finance private service delivery from public revenue. And that changes the equation completely because it changes the principal-agent relationship. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, and I'd certainly be interested if the report could put some empirical clothes on the flesh of those hypothetical bones.
Yes, no, these are, I think, two slightly different questions. One is really deep. One is a bit more empirical. I could start with the empirical question that whether the growth, as you say, may have been exaggerated. It's true that the data do not suggest an incredibly rapid expansion of private provision around the world, and sometimes it's. I think that's also my perception. But the data that we have are not that great. So it's a bit hard to say because within what the government reports as private, there's such big variations between countries that it's hard to really explain, give the accurate picture. Just the classic example that comes to my mind is when you look at UIS data, the UK tertiary education system is presented as 100% private, which is not quite what one might perceive from as an other observer. So there are a lot of challenges with some of this data. But overall, I would agree with you that there are some doubts as to whether how rapid that expansion has been and whether, as you say, it might have been reaching its limits. And I would probably think that because there was such high demand, given the more appropriate conditions in the 2000s for education to expand, and because the governments were not able to provide, then maybe we reached an equilibrium in some of the poorer countries that is higher than the one we reached in higher income countries in decades past. So we might well even see that declining, and maybe COVID, with the effect it has on private school, may see, as we have seen apparently in some countries, out migration from the private to the public school. So the equilibrium may even be lower. So that's something that needs to be explored. I don't think we have enough quality data to be able to say that, but we'll do our best. Your question whether that there will be a pressure for more for governments to fund private schools to support them more, it's an open question that it's hard to understand. I think the key issue, and that's something we are covering in the report, is how are public attitudes shaped, between public and private provision of education. It's a remarkably under-researched topic compared to other fields of economic activity or economic and social activity. There's not much, but we have some new evidence that we will be presenting on that tries to go a little bit beyond the high-income countries. Not much, but at least some inklings. And that's why the examination of attitudes and the battle of ideas and how people try to get into people's minds whether one particular type of provision is better or not is very important to examine, because that's then how ultimately there might be some pressure or not for governments to support private schools. It's something we'll be looking at. I cannot provide an answer, but it's definitely a potential threat. It's not something that we have necessarily seen very widely, but it has happened in some countries. Whether the example of some countries could be translated into others is more doubtful. It's not necessarily some experience that could be translated. On the theory of change, I think it's a very deep question. I need to really think and reflect about it. But you're right, and that's something we should not forget, that really public provision is at the end of the day, and that's what essentially the framework for action has in mind when it says that governments are the duty bearers, is really important for sustainable development. The ideas that may be propagated, the ideas that may be distributed through education systems, if they fall outside public provision, there are important concerns there. And I think I would say the, let's say, most extreme example of non-state provision is homeschooling in the United States. So imagine a system where basically a situation where education systems fall apart in the aftermath of COVID. Schools, in some countries, stop operating. Let's say I'm just being, metaphorical here, but people withdraw children from schools and they prefer to teach them at home. What is the implication of that, and where will that take us? Again, there could be different ways of looking at it, but we do see evidence that in the United States, which has the largest homeschooling provision in the world, it's often driven by communities that want to disassociate themselves from the rest of society and form their own, belief systems that set them apart. Something that really leads to a breakdown in social cohesion and situations that are not really very helpful for sustainable development. So, I mean, I'm taking an extreme example, but I think I would imagine your thinking also goes down that way. What if somehow public education systems lose ground and leads to situations that are outside, the context that we have been used to so far?
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think you see a lot of that already happening, and I'm thinking of work we've done in Bihar, but I know we don't have time to go into it in any detail.
All right,
so don't hesitate to send it down. I know you've sent us some ideas already before, Keith, but any more specific example would be highly appreciated.
Sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Keith, for your question. I want to go to the hand raise now. We've got a question from, once again, I apologize if I mispronounce our name here. So to Likat Ali Hazanzada.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. Me again. Basically, this time I would like to raise a question to a different kind of non-state actor. Armed group, insurgents, and any kind of groups actually which oppose education, specifically target girls and women. In this case, again, Afghanistan. Given that Taliban had historic hostility with the UN in the late 90s, ousted UN from Afghanistan as the agent of the West, and and even after post 2009 2001 Afghanistan, Taliban has hugely targeted the girls' school. In 2012, David reported that 40% of attacks has been done by the Taliban toward girls' school, while just 19% of the education or secondary school were allocated to the girls. Given that now most of the rural communities controlled by the Taliban, and there is no presence of the security forces, either Afghan security forces or NATO security forces, as an excuse for the Taliban to resist education. So how can UNESCO or UN influence the Taliban not to hinder girls and women from education in the rural areas, especially in the southeastern part of Afghanistan?
Liaquat, thank you very much. It's a very good question. All I can say is that we also incorporate, I was referring earlier to the how the report tries to be universal. We have also commissioned a paper specifically on education systems that are operating outside the system. Usually these are rebel systems, we call them, in a kind of in a shorthand, and they are also non-state actors. So they also fall under the definition that we provide. So we're reviewing 4 education systems that, of course, is going to maybe cause us some problems, but that's, yes, also the advantage of the report being independent. But when we refer to rebel groups that governments are not particularly happy about, some of them are current, some of them are historic, but operated in recent history. It's very important to look at the education they provided. So we will be addressing these questions and the implications for the governments and for the international community to act.
Excellent, thank you. I know
Thank you very much.
We've got some other good questions in the chat box. We've got about just over half an hour left. I'm going to try to cluster these a little bit around kind of the framing of the report. So
please remember that I will need to go in 2 minutes. So I'll be leaving you to Anna's able hand. So with apologies again.
Yeah, excellent, Manos. Thank you so much for joining. So I know you need to take off when.
I can take maybe one more question, but
okay, excellent. So let's start with, I think this goes right off of the last question a little bit on looking at provision. So Maria Ron Balsera, would you like to add to your question in the chat box?
Thank you very much. I know that Manos doesn't have a lot of time. So yeah, it would be great to know whether you are commissioning like more papers or you have more research, particularly on the impact of non-state actors, of providers on gender and particularly on inclusion, because the data that is out there is that normally private schools, they don't tend to have, children with disabilities are not really proportionally represented in those schools, particularly when profit is an issue. Thank you.
Yes, that's also maybe a question that Anna can respond. Just to say that we did, of course, cover the issue of non-state actors in education in the inclusion report. As I mentioned, what is really important is to recognize how non-state actors often step in to fill gaps that governments do not provide. So let's say, generally speaking, a positive influence which maintains the issue of, it's basically again, I repeat to Joanna's example, the bricks on the ground waiting for the tarmac to come. But it's also very important to recognize that in some cases, some non-state actors operate with particular sets of beliefs of how they see inclusion, which may or may not be in line with government policies, and that's also makes it important to regulate the provision and the services they offer. Sometimes these are on contract, so they might be a bit more accountable, but sometimes they're not. And it's important to also keep that perspective, how some of these provisions are made. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm also looking at the clock, so I'm thinking I should be stepping out.
So thank you so much, Manos, for joining.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for organizing this, Will. It's very, very helpful. Thank you.
Bye, Manos.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, Anna, do you want to add anything to Manos' response?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question and already for the previous question that were all very, very interesting. Concerning this one, so I would add to what Manos said that there will be a gender review, first of all. So the non-state actor, as Manos said, we also publish a gender review that takes the team and goes through it concerning gender. So many of the issues that are related to gender in provision or regulation, governance, and innovation and influence will be also examined there. And so if you have any example, any material to share, that will be great. Concerning the global report, the issue of course, of inclusion and also gender will be considered and analyzed, and in particular the issue of inclusion in the chapter on provision that will look at the public. I mean, who are the students that are really taught and manage to access private schools? And again, it goes beyond the gender, of course. It looks at rural and urban differences. It looks at differences across income. So that's something that is important for the report, and it will be tackled again. I would say, and add, if you have any material, any case studies that you think it's really prominent and need to be considered, please share with us. And another thing that I'd like to highlight, because it's really something that explains the spirit of the report in general, but of this report, we have something that is at the core of the report is the equity and quality. So everything that is related or to equity will be really upfront in the report. And this concerns the consideration of the school segregation issues or other issues that really mean exclusion of some groups from the schools. And so that's something, and it will be looked also in terms not only of provision, but also of regulation, because so Manos said that what we are doing we are preparing the profile of country profiles in the areas of non-state actors in education, looking at provisions and governance of regulation. So, and in particular, we are building a set of indicators because that will be helpful to map the qualitative content of the profiles for the report. And so we look also in terms of access, if there are groups that are either excluded or targeted by regulation to make equitable access a reality, even if we talk about, of course, regulation in theory, and there is the issue of implementation that is another side of something that will be tackled in the report.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. I want to go back up. Raja Kumari, you asked a question on the chat box on early childhood care and education. I was wondering if you can say a little more about your question and maybe even talk about what motivates the question for you. So, Raja Kumari, are you still with us? Okay, we've got another question on provision. We'll come back to you if you are still with us. Stephanie, you've got two good questions, I think, in the chat box. So Stephanie Vignon. One on school segregation, which I think fits nicely into this. Can you maybe share a little more on your first question?
Sure. As you can hear, it's
Stefan. Sorry. So sorry about that.
No problem. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so the question, well, Anna, Cristina kind of answered it, but my question, I had two questions. The first one was, will school segregation be front and center in your report? And you kind of hinted at it, saying that equity was at the core, but really, for us, and I'm talking from a parents association fighting school segregation, if your report can go in clear language, in details, explaining, how it works really on the ground, how are kids selected, excluded, for us, that would be a great contribution, because our goal, our role is to lobby elected officials, and if we have clear language tables, for us, it's really useful. But that's just my own little point of view. And the second question was, will you explore how private schools transform the public system? And just to give you our example here in Quebec, we have a strong subsidized private sector. They have a 20% market share in the secondary education. And in order to react to that strongness, the public system engages in competition. And so it created this third network of selective public schools. Mm-hmm. And so you have they're public schools, but they have exams, fees, really expensive, $10,000, alternative schools, art schools, and basically they fight private schools on their own turf. So I'm wondering if the report will show how the public system also is transformed negatively by competition from the private sector.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So just on the first part, I started to answer. I didn't go at length on this answer, but so in addition to what I said, there is another thing that the report discusses thoroughly, is the issue of parent choice and the issue of school choice. So some of the things you said are very important, and how people select the schools, or how the schools can select the kids are part of the discussion, of course, in the report. So that will be an issue that will be not only in the provision chapter, but also in the regulation and also in the governance, because there is the issue, of course, of school segregation that is important, but there is the issue of segregation in education that is much broader, and it holds at any level of education, and also in at adult age. So in the chapter of adult learning is also something that is very important. Now, and the chapter of regulations consider also these different issues of school choice, and so you will find it through the entire report. Now, concerning the second question, the second question that you asked, that is about the issue of how private schools, I would like to say something again that Manos said, but which is maybe important to remind, is that the report talk about non-state actors. So non-state actors, taking it in a very broad meaning. So in addition to private, really private school or actors, it will discuss a large range of private actors, of non-state actors. And all these actors have the power and also the space nowadays to influence public discourse and education policies. And all this will be discussed in the chapter concerning innovation and influence, because, of course, there are different ways in which non-state actors can influence education policy, and it is, Manos started talking about that. It is about lobbying, but it is about really taking part in different instances that can be, for example, parliamentary committees. We didn't talk about that, but this is very important, or being involved directly in the making of public policies. And this is not just for private actors, as we may think about that, but also with a range of actors that have a real interest in education, that are parents association. So in this thing is that, so this influence of public policy will be, of course, at the core of a chapter on influence and innovation, but also discussed at either other level of education. As Manos said, the first 5 chapters will be mainly about compulsory education levels, so primary and secondary education, but all this issue of influence matter also for higher education, and you will find it in the report.
Excellent. Thanks, Anna, for the response there. I want to go now. We've got a good question on governance. So I'm moving through the themes here, but feel free to add questions as we're talking about these kind of different themes. We've got a good question on governance in the chat from Teresa, who's talking about justiciability of violation. So Teresa, would you like to add to your question?
Thank you. My question.
Oh, you're quite low on the volume, Teresa. Can you?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Anna, can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay. The question was concerning whether the report tackles anything to do with access to justice, and especially the issue of violations, human rights violations caused by non-state actors or actions by non-state actors, whether affecting the children or affecting in terms of access to justice for the education system in itself. Wanted to find out whether the report tackles, I think it's an important angle to look at.
Thanks a lot for the question, which is another important one. I should say at the beginning that this was really, and Will knows it, so it was at the center of the Accountability in Education report, and it took really a big share of the discussion there, as the state as the duty bearer of the protection of the right to education. And so again, in this case, of course, this issue of how to protect against violation of the right to education that comes in through other actors will be in the report, of course, and it will appear both in terms of in the accountability, of course, discussion, because this is something that is very important, how to keep accountable the different and diverse range of actors that operate in education, and how to protect the right to education of people whose right have been violated. But it goes also beyond that, because we discuss that and we think about that in terms of the implementation, the lack, I would say, the lack of implementation of regulation. In the first part of this webinar this morning, there has been a very interesting and insightful discussion on the application of regulation and regulation tout court. And I think that is something that is really core to the protection of the right to education, how or to what extent regulation are really implemented or are just principles that are not implemented. And so that's there will be a discussion that will go beyond the issue of violation of the right to education, as maybe the accountability report did, but also the issue of corruption, bribes, etc., that will be discussed in a sense. Answer to your question, because how many people are left behind because they cannot access or are excluded from education. So that will be something that will be discussed. And again, please, if you have interesting cases to share, do it, because it's we are eager to have this material, and especially because even if Manos said that the deadline of the second draft came last week, we have a regional report on South Asia that gives additional opportunity to discuss these issues even in other countries, and the gender report. So please don't hesitate to send whatever you have on these issues, because are really core to the report. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the question, and Anna for your response. I want to move to our last theme, and then we'll kind of have more just an open conversation here. So, which is on influence, and you've talked about this a little bit already, but we had another question from Rima. I know, Rima, you asked this question a while ago. I don't know if you're still with us and want to jump in.
Yes, hi, Anna.
Hi.
So I have a very good question, and I wanted to understand that to what extent do non-state actors actually engage in shaping or influence public policy? And what kind of role do think tanks and independent educationists have? So just to give an example, in India, we had the recent National Education Policy 2020, which saw a lot of non-state actors coming together with in consultative dialogues, with the government and the Ministry of Education to come out with the policy. So I wanted to understand, what kind of role do non-state actors play? Is it more of a consultative kind of a role in shaping and influencing policy, or does that go beyond that?
Thanks a lot. Another great question, and another topic that we cover. So, as Mano said, from the think piece, the framework which we have used for this report really builds about these different pillars that are provision, regulation, and governance, finance, but also influence and innovation. And it's a little bit difficult to talk about innovation, because many people think automatically that we are talking about technology, but this is not the case necessarily. This means also to discuss and to understand the way non-state actors intersect and interconnect with the state in the decision-making process concerning education. And this is something that really it's a part that will feature in the chapter on influence and innovation. But the chapter will also be much broader, because it will look at what are the strategies that non-state actors use to either set the narrative or the frame of education discourse. And this may be through lobbying and advocates, but also building knowledge and evidence, or informing policy debates, or making the decision, participating in the decision-making process of education policy. And the example of India you just gave is something that is in the report, but also in the issue of innovative way of governance, because the draft education policies, at least for India, discussed how to make the participation of non-state actors even more important to these governance processes. And the chapter was discussed network of that may be very powerful in setting the narratives and the frame, and how they do it. So, for example, through the technicalization or the standardization debates. Because the issue, for example, we didn't talk about that, but the issue of high stakes exam and how non-state actors engage in that is very important too. So it's certainly something that will feature and in the report.
Thank you, Anna.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. So I want to open it up now. I think we've covered most of the questions in the chat box. We've got about 10 minutes left for other people to ask questions, but also this is a chance for you to share your own expertise here. So as Anna's mentioned multiple times, like the GEM report is still looking for examples of what non-state actors look like in your countries, in your systems. So if there are certain things that we can learn from everybody else here, we'd be open to hearing from audience members and participants on their own experience, their own expertise, as well as additional questions.
And yeah, if I can say something, it's really very important if you can share the challenges really in terms of real examples or your experience, what really is held back, can hold back the implementation of regulation. We know very well that this is a huge problem. Even when regulation are there, they are not applied. So where are the important areas that we need to feature in the report? This will be very helpful. But for all the discussion we have had today.
Excellent. So if anybody would be interested in either adding to the chat box, or you can just raise your hand and we'll do that.
Well, just one thing, if there is the person that asked the question on the early childhood education, the answer is yes, of course, there will be a chapter that will be devoted to non-state actors in early childhood education. So that's a very short answer, but it's an important part of the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a hand up. What happened? So, Alan Renwaju? Hi, welcome. Oh. I think I might have just lost you. Okay, well, I think sadly we just lost her. Hopefully she's able to rejoin and ask her question.
Yeah.
So, well, while she's doing that, I'm going to take this opportunity, Anna, to ask a question. So thinking about non-state actors in education, we know that there are kind of the hot button topics that are fueling a lot of the debate, like the first part we had today on low-fee private schools. And Manos gave us some idea of what might be one of the unique things that the GEM report is able to add to this conversation when he talked about maybe more of an emphasis on the important role of parental perceptions of private and public provision. So wondering, I know you can't share findings here, but if there are other key things that you think that have been commonly omitted from the story that the GEM report might be able to contribute to?
Okay, so that's for me or for?
That's for you.
Okay, good. I mean, as you said, I cannot share findings, but I think that there is the debate, as you said, and as we heard also this morning, has the tendency to focus on a particular topic, on a specific topic. Low-fee private school is one of that, and the issue is really more about quality and equity in this discussion. It has been said already this morning that regulation is a key issue on that, but it was also asked the question if there is this kind of school should be regulated. I would say that the discussion that the GEM report is much broader than that, is go beyond, because in some cases non-state actors are needed to reach the most marginalized or the most vulnerable. And this is a part of the debate that should not be hidden or should be discussed. So at that point, the question becomes how, when this happens, we may be sure that this happens in the right condition that leave no one behind. And I think this is really, when we talk about equity or quality, this is really the core of the debate in this discussion. Is not to take position against or for, is just to put what we want to bring into the discussion. And that's why in And so that's also one of the reasons why we are looking at all these different issues that we discussed already, but we discuss also emerging areas that are really something that are threatening in some countries the provision of public education. One may be the issue of private tutoring. We didn't discuss that here, but it is something that it's really something very important, and we are going to look really thoroughly about it and to discuss it. And again, why? Because these increasingly states not only, I would say, tolerate private tutoring, may invest. So the question becomes how, what is the impact of this intervention that divest, I would say, the public money into activities that are not really regulated or can be afforded only by those that can afford. So, and again, this is really the work we are doing with the peer learning, with the country profiles. What the JAM report can add there is to provide a tool of peer learning for countries where the different practices in provision and regulation are explained. I would say that what the JAM report is doing too is going beyond the traditional idea of distinction of non-state actors on the base of ownership or management. We feel that there is something that is also very important, may drive some mechanism for segregation that is can be values orientation in the school. So we feel that the topic is very broad and very difficult, but we are sure that putting quality of education and equity of education at the center, we will add value to the debate.
Excellent, thank you. It looks like Olin Renwaju has been able to rejoin us. So, yes. Welcome back.
Thank you and welcome. I lead an organization, so I just want to share an experience. I lead an organization in Nigeria called Sustainable Education and Enterprise Development, CEID. And we largely are a network of low-fee private schools in Lagos. We support, that's Lagos, Nigeria, and we support these schools. We started the network following the DFID project in Lagos called Deepen, that's developing effective private education in Nigeria. And what we see is, as mentioned, when we talk about quality and equity, the Lagos school market is largely driven by non-state education. So to provide some context, Lagos has just about 1,700 public schools, and we have over 20,000 private schools, of which over 60% of these schools are low-fee private schools. So our network, where we have over 730 of these schools, we support them when it comes to the issue of quality. And one of the critical things that we've seen is, the school owners are wondering, what exactly does quality mean? And quality, what does that mean? And that led us to develop a framework called the CEID Quality Assessment Tool, which kind of helps to define what quality means in the context of Lagos, in the context of Nigeria, looking at frameworks from different countries, just so that these schools can measure themselves against something and they can know how to improve. So the network supports the schools to help them improve based on the indicators that we have developed, and they're able to work their way towards improving the quality of their schools, which leads to funding, because then the banks and the financial institutions can support specific indicators that can help them improve their quality for the children. And in terms of equity, most times, most parents choose to, so most of the public schools in Lagos are largely primary, but we still have spaces in primary schools where parents don't want to send their children to because they feel that they get more accountability with the low-cost private schools and they're closer to home. So it's issue of access, accessibility. Affordability is relative because sometimes, you know, in Lagos, they talk about public schools being free, but then you still have to pay the education levy, you still need to buy your chair and your table, you still need to do all the other things. And it eventually becomes more expensive than a low-fee private school sometimes. And sometimes the issue of access. So we have some communities that the cost of transportation exceeds the cost of the low-fee private school. So parents tend to just pick that option above sending their child to a public school. So in terms of policy, we also do advocacy. We work with the Ministry of Education, Department of Private Education, and the Office of Education Quality Assurance in Lagos. And a lot of the things we work around are the issues of ensuring quality. The government is also looking at how to regulate in terms of ensuring that the schools are properly registered, they know where they are, they can identify them, they can provide support, and then they can work around ensuring that they get the support they need to be able to be eventually approved. And then we recently started working with the government where they set up a fund to support low-fee private schools, which is the first of its kind anywhere I've thought of. It's a 5 billion naira fund to support low-fee private schools from COVID and to improve their chances of getting approved as well. So a lot is being done. The state government actually recognizes that education in Lagos, you cannot take out the role of low-fee private schools. And these non-state actors, if they decide to shut all of them down, there's no space to keep the children because the largest population of the poor are being educated by low-fee private schools.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to later respond there and then also give any final comments because I know we're closing down here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this example. And can you, if you can send the material related, but it's something that we have already to some extent in the report. I would like to say that. All this discussion is really interesting and show once again how really heated is the debate about non-state actors in education. But I think that we are all moved by the same objective, that is really to make sure that the education that is provided is quality and equitable, and this is something that is really important for the Global Education Monitoring Report, as you know already. There is something that is also very important for the report this year, that is COVID, and of course we didn't talk about it during this discussion, but COVID is affecting a lot non-state actors in education and public education, of course, but the way it is affected doesn't mean that it's just concern the fact that there are schools that are closing down and then leaving many students behind. So how to make sure that this is really something that is visible and there are rules in place not to have this happens, because we know that, and also this morning that has been discussed, the issue of school closures, when non-state actors are moved by profit motives or see a decline of enrollment, they can close very easily sometimes. And so the COVID is affecting the discussion and the presence of non-state and states' respective role in education, also with respect to the issue of technology, that is very important. So again, all this theme will be discussed and analyzed in the report, and it will be great to hear from you if you have something to add, and that I'm sure, of course, that you have in terms of example and case studies. And thanks a lot. It has been really very insightful.
Excellent. Well, I want to Thank you, Anna, and obviously thank Manos for appearing earlier for us. Thanks everybody for being able to participate in today's Non-State Actors in Education event by the CEID Research Group. Really appreciate all the different questions and examples you're able to share with us today. So that brings us to the end of our event. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Please do feel free to follow us on Twitter at @MoraiHouseCEID and tweet at us at #CEID Research Group. So thanks everybody. I'm going to stop the recording here and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks a lot, Will. Thanks to all. It has been great. Thank you.